morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. So I've been saying I'm looking forward to the coming 5 months and the years thereafter with Gary Johnson, and I'm looking forward to taking strong positions and sticking with them. I think that's what we've got to do. Move the needle. And moving the needle in politics isn't always easy, and you got to stick to your guns, and I think Gary and I have the track record to prove that we're going to be able to do that. In fact, it so happens that I have a long history in my life of taking strong positions, pushing them, seeing them come to fruition, sometimes years ahead of my time, sometimes as much as a decade. When I joined the Justice Department under President Reagan, every U.S. attorney, every federal prosecutor had to choose a top priority in their state. I chose public corruption. I was the only one out of 94 U.S. attorneys to say that public corruption was the #1 problem in my state. But it was. The same party had been in power for 50 years. I don't care what party it is. If they're in power for 50 years, they're going to be corrupt. So I took them on. I filed 111 public corruption cases in my 5 years as U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts. I got convictions. That's not the punchline. The punchline is I got convictions in 110 out of 111. Okay? Even my good friend Rudy Giuliani in New York couldn't touch that percentage record of convictions. And now public corruption is absolutely at the top of the Justice Department's agenda, and it has been ever since I went down to Washington as head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. I got promoted from local guy to national guy, and I made public corruption our #1 down there, and I don't think it's ever left the top of the Justice Department's agenda since then. But that came out of one district. It's an example of the states being laboratories of democracy, trying something out in one state that then goes viral and goes national. In terms of prosecution of banks for not living up to their obligations to report cash transactions, which is very important in the prosecution of narcotics and organized crime cases, the big international cartels, because those guys, they don't like to get around the massive amounts of material they're trafficking in, but they won't get far from the cash. So if the banks don't file these reports, it's very hard to bring those cases. So in 1985 was the breakthrough year there, and there were 6 big cases filed against banks for basically failing to report cash, and it was a form of fraud. It came to be called money laundering, or it was an aid of money laundering. Guess how many of those cases, those 6 cases, were filed in my district in Massachusetts? The answer is all 6 of them. Okay? So Congress gets very interested when it sees that. And one was the Bank of Boston, and one was the Bank of New England. These were not fly-by-night little banks. And the Bank of New England went to trial, and the briefs in that case were the national textbooks on corporate criminal liability. Broke new law, made a lot of law. Those were trailblazing prosecutions. So Congress got interested. This was a national and international problem. And Bill Roth, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, asked me to come down and testify about this, which I did. And it resulted in the federal anti-money laundering legislation of 1986, which is landmark legislation and stays on the books to this day. So that was another instance of starting in Massachusetts, and it wound up as national policy in Washington. In terms of organized crime, La Cosa Nostra had a grip on matters in New England for years and years and years before I got into office. We did a very complicated, long-running investigation, indicted the top 3 echelons of organized crime, La Cosa Nostra in New England, wiped out all 3 levels. La Cosa Nostra in New England has never recovered to this day, which is 20 years later.
Good.
My personal favorite category of cases that I filed when I was U.S. Attorney was not all that numerous, but it was an impact class. It involved phony disability pensions. If somebody in the city of Boston had a beef with the mayor and had to go, what was the exit? The exit was the guy would come into his doctor and say, I had a slip and fall, my neck is killing me, I'm wearing a Thomas collar, or I was in a terrible auto crash and my spine is injured. So they would go see complacent docs who would say, yeah, this guy's in real trouble. So they would get a disability pension worth $30,000, $35,000 a year. And it was with a 30-year life expectancy. These people were in the prime of health, in the prime of their lives. They just had a political golden exit. So those disability pensions were worth $1 million apiece. And it was a time-honored tradition in the city of Boston. And it completely outraged me. So I called in the U.S. Postal Service, which actually has very good investigative and inspection services, and they followed these guys around on weekends and saw them, jumping around and nailing a new roof on their house, and it was just obvious that they were lying. And we prosecuted these guys. All three of them went to trial. They all said, this is a matter of essentially local concern, butt out. You don't even have jurisdiction. Well, they all three got convicted, and they got pretty long sentences too, because the judge thought this was emblematic of a real problem. But the kicker here is that the next year, the number of disability pensions applied for in the city of Boston went down by 87%. So that's an indication of how long people have been stealing from the taxpayers with impunity. And again, it was a small number of cases, but it was an impact initiative. When I became governor, the state budget was $14 billion. The state was, this is January of '91. I immediately followed Governor Dukakis, who was a three-term Democrat. There was a $2 billion hole in the budget out of $14 billion. Everyone said, no, you can't plug that gap. I said, oh, I think I can cut $2 billion in fat out of this budget in short order. Governor Dukakis said, Billy Weld's a nice enough boy. We used to be in the same law firm, but he just doesn't understand anything. There's no fat to cut out. We've already cut through nerve. We've cut through muscle. And now what he's proposing is to cut into the bone marrow. That's what he wants to do. So I took office on January 3rd. I had to file my first budget on February 28th. Between January 3rd and February 28th, we identified $2 billion, 14% of the budget, in cuts, and submitted a balanced budget on February 28th, okay? In the teeth of unified opposition. The next thing I noticed was that the state workforce was a lot bigger than it needed to be. It was 72,000 people. We did an analysis of the workforce needs of all the services that we felt the government had a duty to deliver, and we were left over with 8,000 state employees who it seemed to us were completely unnecessary. So I furloughed them all on day one of my administration. I cut 8,000 people off the payroll on day one. They stayed off, and in 2 terms, I never got so much as a postcard saying, where is that essential state employee that you furloughed back in January of 1991? Again, they said it couldn't be done. Well, what you do when people tell you it can't be done is to do it. And then you say, well, I just did it. And that's the way you have to do things in politics sometimes. In terms of policy initiatives, again, I kind of trod where no one had trod before. I've gotten to be very good friends with a good number of gays and lesbians during the campaign, and came out of the chute my first couple of months with a whole bunch of executive orders overturning existing state policy, which denied gays and lesbians visitation rights, bereavement rights. I mean, it was atrocious what the legal position to be gay or lesbian in Massachusetts in 1991 was. So I repealed that, rolled it back. These to me seem very minor steps. It was a national firestorm. People said, you can't do this. You're overturning the order. This is for the legislature. These are societal judgments. You can't do that. And again, my response was, I just did. And that all held up. No other governor touched that for the longest time. And I didn't care. But those policy steps all ripened into not just policy in other states, but into national policy as well. One of my proudest moments was to appoint Margaret Marshall to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. Margaret Marshall was a South African. I happen to know that she was head of the National Union of Students in South Africa, and I also happen to know that she had been expelled from the country by the apartheid regime in South Africa, and I thought that was a pretty good day's work, given what the apartheid regime in South Africa looked like. So she was a totally unknown South African who emigrated to the United States and was a good corporate litigator in a good Boston law firm, but no one would have looked twice at her. She was married to a liberal columnist for the New York Times, Tony Lewis, who is a personal hero of mine because his book, Gideon's Trumpet, about the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, sent me to law school. Anyway, I nominated Margie Marshall to the Supreme Court to the great surprise of the press, which had predicted Margaret Marshall has 2 chances to be appointed to the Supreme Court, slim and none. Turned out they were wrong about that. She turned out to be a great Chief Justice, and I knew enough about how the international community worked to know that her being expelled from the country and keeping her head high meant that she had a degree of sand in her, as Huck Finn used to say of Mary Jane. She had more sand than any girl I ever knew, said Huck. He didn't know he was in love with Mary Jane, but he was. So I thought Margaret Marshall had sand. And she wound up writing the opinion holding that equality of marriage rights for gays and lesbians is constitutionally compelled under both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of both the Massachusetts Constitution and the federal Constitution. The rest is history. That case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's where the whole thing started, in Massachusetts with my appointee. I take particular pride in that. In the area of education, it became clear to me that we had a problem with education, particularly in the inner cities, and that when people got to 12th grade, they were being given graduating diplomas, even if when they got to junior college, they immediately had to enroll in remedial courses in both reading and mathematics because they weren't up to the job. So I said, okay, no more social promotions. Everyone said you're the biggest racist in the history of Massachusetts because look where this hits. It hits in inner cities, minority youth, and you're just denying them their high school diploma and everybody else can sail on. So I said, no, I'm going to stick with this. And we put in high stakes, high standards, and then high stakes tests in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. If you didn't pass those tests in 12th grade, you didn't go on from high school. Again, huge charges of racism. Okay, so at that point, Massachusetts ranked in the middle of the pack in terms of student performance. Starting 3 years after those tests went in, Massachusetts has ranked #1 in the United States in both reading and mathematics ever since. Another problem I noticed was welfare. The welfare rolls were enormous. 17% of the population had some claim there. And it looked to me like we weren't taking advantage of a potential, which is tapping the workforce represented by these able-bodied welfare recipients. If they had kids in school, that's different. But so I put in a work requirement for welfare. If you want welfare benefits, courtesy of the taxpayers, we're going to find you a job. You don't have to find the job yourself, don't worry. But there's no substitute for work, I said. Not thinking about work, not looking for work, only work. And we have a lot of work that needs to get done. So again, taking a burden off the taxpayers, we made these jobs available, working in parks, schools, doing cleanup work, and those jobs were ready for anyone who wanted to apply for welfare. Well, guess what? The welfare rolls went down by 85% the next year also. There's an unlimited demand for anything that's free, right? So if you're a policymaker in the government, you have to think about that. That statute also, which we passed in '94, became the model for the Welfare Reform Act National, which President Clinton signed in 1996. Absolutely modeled, almost word for word, on our statute in 1994. In other policy initiatives, I think, again, I was kind of ahead of my time. I was the national chairman of U.S. term limits at a time when it was thought to be a fringe idea. You know, people back in the early 90s thought the taxpayers don't have a right to limit the size of their government. We can't have term limits because we'll then lose all this wisdom in the legislature. And, you know, we moved the needle there. We persuaded people that, well, you know, unfortunately they've not been persuaded in Washington, but that was something where I put my shoulder to the wheel at the national level. The same in terms of privatizing government functions, where that can be done to guarantee greater efficiency. Again, a savings for the taxpayer. So the two things I was national head of were U.S. term limits and the National Privatization Council. And I think both of those things are going to become national policy. They haven't yet, but I predict they're going to. So I was the first Republican governor elected in Massachusetts in 20 years. At the end of my first term, I was re-elected with 71% of the vote. Okay? Massachusetts was 3.5 to 1 Democratic. It was the most Democratic state in the Union, and we got 71% of the vote. After me, we had 4 Republican governors in a row. People kind of liked the dog food that they'd been served during the Weld-Cellucci years. So I guess the bottom line is, in public life, I have been an impact player, and I respectfully suggest to you that it's good to have an impact player on your side, and it's uncharacteristic of me to point out the things I've just pointed out, but my mother once said to me, "It ain't boasting if you've done it." Hope she's right. So I look forward to taking strong positions with Gary, if we're fortunate enough to get nominated and get into office. And if we're nominated, I promise you that I'm going to work as hard as I know how to raise all the money I know how to raise. And I've had a lot of experience there. I was the national finance chair for Pete Wilson when he ran for president, the governor of California, who had an enormous war chest. I was the New York co-chair for Mitt Romney when he ran for president, both in finance co-chair, both in 2008 and 2012. So I do know where some of the bodies are buried. And I do know that some of the big bodies that have not yet signed on with Mr. Trump harbor libertarian sympathies and points of view. So I'm absolutely going to work at that. I'm a libertarian now. I'm no longer a Republican. I'm going to work. So Gary and I are going to be working, as Gary has before, of course, to elect down-ballot libertarians to improve our numbers and our presentation nationwide. I do think that, and that will be a pleasure. You know, I did it as governor, and I'll do it as vice president, living so long and the creek don't rise. But it's going to be a great enterprise working together. I don't think we need that much luck. Gary and I need, of course, your support to be nominated, and we understand that. I'm here asking you for that support. I do think that if you need a crusader, and I think you do. I think we do. I think the party does. I think Gary Johnson and Bill Weld fit the bill as the kind of crusaders you need to represent you as we go forward. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if there is time, which I don't.